So in the last module, we introduced the concept of monopoly, and we determined how a monopolist determines its profit-maximizing quantity of output and price and economic profits. And we saw that monopoly was the most inefficient form of competition, that it wasn't productively efficient, it wasn't allocatively efficient, it produced a lower quantity than the socially optimal output, it charged a higher price than the socially optimal price under perfect competition. So because of all of these negative outcomes, we saw that there really was only one positive effect of monopoly, and that's when there was something called a natural monopoly that experienced economies of scale, where lower average total cost was decreasing over the long run, and it made more sense to have one firm producing the good than to have multiple firms competing. So in this module, we're going to see how we as a society deal with monopoly through public policy. And we're going to compare the effects of monopoly and perfect competition on the well-being of society. And we'll explain how government policymakers address the problems that are posed by the monopoly form of market structure. What we are going to see in this module is that in U.S. law, in American law, monopoly is illegal in many cases. But sometimes, because of natural monopolies and the benefit they create to society, we allow them, but when we do, we regulate them in the interest of society. So first, we want to look at the welfare effects of monopoly. Now, in the previous module, we saw that when we compared monopoly to perfect competition, the quantity produced in the market under monopoly was less than the quantity produced under perfect competition, and the price charged by the monopolist was higher than the price charged under perfect competition. And we saw that monopoly profit was greater than zero, even in the long run. Now, this sounds bad for consumers and good for the firm, but is it bad for economic efficiency? Well, we need to compare the total welfare under perfect competition and compare it to total welfare under monopoly. So we'll go back to the simplifying assumption that marginal cost equals average total cost and is a horizontal line, and see what happens there. Now, by reducing output and raising price above marginal cost, we will see that a monopolist captures some of the consumer surplus as profit for itself, and this causes deadweight loss to society. To avoid deadweight loss, government policy often attempts to prevent monopoly behavior and to limit it. But when monopolies are created, rather than being natural monopolies, governments should act to prevent them from forming and break up existing ones. The government policies that are used to prevent or eliminate monopolies in this country are known as antitrust policy, a trust being another name for a monopoly. So antitrust means anti-monopoly. And we've had antitrust policy in this country ever since the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890. So why would we regulate a monopoly? Well, one, we want to keep prices lower, closer to what they would be under perfect competition than what they would be under monopoly, and to make monopolies more efficient than they would normally be. So how does the government regulate monopolies? Well, one way is to use price controls to limit the price that a monopoly can charge, and we call that a price ceiling, to set a maximum price that a monopoly can charge, not to allow the monopoly to charge the price that it would be allowed to charge if it operated freely in the market. Now, why don't taxes work? Why not tax a monopoly? Well, taxes would reduce supply, and that's part of the problem with monopoly, is that a monopoly produces a lower than desirable, socially optimal supply than what we would get under perfect competition. So we don't want to tax it and limit the supply even further. So where should the government place the price ceiling if that's how we regulate a monopoly? Should we set it at the socially optimal price? Well, that would be a price where the price would be equal to marginal cost, and that would be allocatively efficient. Or do we allow the monopoly to charge a fair return price? In other words, the break-even price for the monopoly. And that would be a price that would be equal to average total cost, and the monopoly would be earning a normal profit. So should the government set the price ceiling at the socially optimal price or at a fair return price? Well, let's go back to perfect competition. The perfectly competitive output you can see here is QC, and the price under perfect competition would be equal to PC, which would be equal to the marginal cost and equal to the average total cost in the simplifying assumption. Total welfare would be the sum of consumer and producer surplus. In this case, you can see that producer surplus is equal to 0, so the entire surplus goes to the consumers. The area of this large triangle will be used as the benchmark so we can compare this triangle to the total surplus under monopoly. And remember that the consumer surplus is the area of a triangle below the demand curve and above the price. Now, this is a market supplied by a monopolist. Notice that the monopoly output is less than under perfect competition. It is now at QM. And the price is now higher than under perfect competition. It's now at PM. It's greater than marginal cost, and it's equal to average total cost, or marginal cost rather, being equal to average total cost. But price is greater than both of those. So total welfare is still the sum of consumer and producer surplus. But now we see that consumer surplus has shrunk from what it was under perfect competition, while producer surplus, while it equaled 0 under perfect competition, has now increased. This producer surplus is transferred from consumers to the firm in the form of profit. However, there is an area that used to belong to consumer surplus that now belongs to nobody. And this is a triangle called deadweight loss. And it shows us that total surplus under monopoly is less than under perfect competition, because some of consumer surplus is lost to the monopolist and some of it is just lost completely. And so with total surplus being the sum of consumer and producer surplus, you can see that the total surplus is smaller than what it was under perfect competition. Total surplus under perfect competition is equal to CSC. Total surplus under monopoly is equal to CSM plus PSM. Because of the deadweight loss, we can see that CSC is greater than CSM plus PSM. Economists see this loss of total welfare as a major drawback to monopoly and as an argument for regulating monopolies or preventing them altogether. But what exactly is the deadweight loss? It represents transactions between QC and QM that could have been made under perfect competition between buyers and sellers, but transactions that are not made under monopoly. These would be mutually beneficial to the buyer and seller, but they are eliminated under monopoly. And this will always occur when the level of output is restricted such that the market price is greater than the marginal cost. Here you can see by comparing these two graphs side by side, total surplus under perfect competition, where consumers get all the surplus and producers get none, and total surplus under monopoly, where some consumer surplus is lost to the producer and goes to the producer in the form of profit, and some is lost completely to society in the form of deadweight loss. So total surplus is reduced under monopoly. And that's why we say monopoly causes inefficiency. Now you have to be prepared to identify and calculate the areas of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss for a monopoly graph on the AP exam. So make sure that you can properly shade those areas, calculate them, and show them on a monopoly graph. Now we said one type of monopoly that society might allow would be a natural monopoly, as opposed to a created monopoly. Because in this situation, one firm can produce the socially optimal quantity at the lowest average total cost due to economies of scale. So when that happens, it is better to have only one firm because average total cost is falling at the socially optimal quantity.